This evening we are to discuss some phases at least of the Greco-Latin philosophical mythology. And I think we perhaps should begin by remembering the words of Varro, who declared that the duration of the world is divided into three parts, which should properly be termed the unknown, the fabulous, and the historical. Now, this is a rather different division from what we are most accustomed to, but Varro goes on to tell us that our concepts and conceptions of those parts of the world's duration which are unknown are set forth in scriptures which relate to such things as precede man or are before his reason and understanding. The second part, which is the fabulous, unfolds through the writings of poets, of mystics, and of those constructors and delineators of myths, of which Homer and Hesiod are typical examples. The third or historical part emerges slowly from the fabulous, and gradually we secure certain footings in known records and accounts, so that gradually in the historic era we become familiar with the positive and proven actions of men and vicissitudes of life and nature. In these divisions, therefore, that which is termed the fabulous is placed between the unknown and the historical. And we may be inclined to quote another statement of this to the effect that mythology is the history of the prehistoric. Now, for man, what is prehistory? It is scarcely to be conceived as merely the record of the world in which he lived prior to his own geniture. More correctly, prehistory for man is the story of himself prior to the period of fable or of legend, or of any record or account which he may retain within his own consciousness, and relating to such matters as he may know only intuitively or inspirationally, or by some communion deeper than reason or understanding. Therefore, we may say that in these three states or periods of his own existence, the first, or the unknown, relates to sleep, and to that night which came before the dawn of consciousness, thus to man's unconscious nature. Fable, or the fabulous era, to dreams, and to those first stirrings of internal symbolism by which man sought to explain or understand the structure of his own nature, and therefore perhaps the first or unknown period may be termed the unconscious, the fabulous period the subconscious, the historical period the objectively conscious. For man's own life, from birth, or man's racial development from the dawn of time, both follow this course and this procedure. The Greeks, being naturally addicted to philosophy, were inclined to philosophize upon their fables. And perhaps this is not different from the standpoint of modern psychology, which is inclined to philosophize upon the fabrics of dreams, and to see in the confused experiences of sleep the keys to the rational processes of the human consciousness. Thus the Greek sought to explain or interpret these ancient fables as having a root in some common, original state of unconscious knowing, and that these fables therefore contain within them truths, realities, and abstract yet mysterious facts which might have bearing and meaning and give us some light or insight into other and more recent happenings. And in thinking about this, lest perhaps we be accused of inventing, I'd like to call first to your attention a few lines or a few paragraphs from Lord Bacon's introduction to his Wisdom of the Ancients, a little work which his lordship dedicated largely to the interpretation of the mythology and legendary of the Greek authors. In his introduction to this work, he writes in one place, "The earliest antiquity lies buried in silence and oblivion, excepting the remains we have of it in sacred writ. This silence was succeeded by poetical fables, and these at length by the writings we now enjoy, so that the concealed and secret learning of the ancients seems separated from the history and knowledge of the following ages by a veil, or a partition wall of fables, interposing between the things that are lost and those that remain." A little later he adds, "Upon deliberate consideration, my judgment is that a concealed instruction and allegory was originally intended in many of the ancient fables. This opinion may in some respects be owing to the veneration I have for antiquity, but more to observing that some fables discover a great and evident similitude, relation, and connection with the thing they signify, as well A little later he adds, "It may pass for a further indication of a concealed and secret meaning that some of these fables are so absurd and idle in their narration as to show and proclaim an allegory, even afar off. A fable that carries probability with it may be supposed invented for pleasure or in imitation of history. But those that could never be conceived or related in this way must surely have a different use. For example, what a monstrous fiction is this, that Jupiter should take Metis to wife, and as soon as he found her pregnant, eat her up, whereby he also conceived, and out of his head brought forth Pallas Athena armed. Certainly no mortal could, but for the sake of the moral it couches, invent such an absurd dream as this, so much out of the road of thought. But the argument of most weight with me is this, that many of these fables by no means appear to have been invented by those persons who relate and divulge them, whether Homer, Hesiod, or others, For if I were assured that they first flowed from these later times and authors that transmit them to us, I should never expect anything singularly great or noble from such an origin. But whoever attentively considers the thing will find that these fables were delivered down and related by these writers, not as matters then first invented or proposed, but as things received and embraced in earlier ages. Besides, as they are differently related by writers nearly of the same age, it is easily perceived that the relators drew from the common stock of ancient tradition and varied but in points of embellishment, which is their own. And this principally raises my esteem of these fables, which I receive not as the product of the age or invention of the poets, but as sacred relics, gentle whispers, and the breath of better times, and from the traditions of more ancient nations came at length into the flutes and trumpets of the Greeks. Now, I think that more or less summarizes the viewpoint that we wish to emphasize or explain or discuss this evening. Namely, that these fables, which have not only descended from old time, but have been perpetuated from generation to generation and from culture to culture, owe their existence and their survival to some secret and purposeful meaning which they possess, which, like the famous animal fables of Aesop, but thinly conceal or clothe moral realities or philosophical facts which are timeless and forever practical, useful, and immediate in their implications. Now, as Bacon points out, and I think no other author has come forward to refute him, the actual origin of the Latin and Greek mythologies is unknown. The Latins derived greatly from the Greeks, but upon a lower level of interpretation. For whereas the Greeks were essentially philosophers, the Latins were essentially economists, men of more practical and material interests and inclinations. And in their keeping, the religious mysteries of other nations lost much of their deeper and more sacred values. But to go then to the Greeks and to discover, if possible, the origin of their legends, I think in most probability the mythology of the Greek nations must be traced to Asia, probably through Egypt. And we are informed by the Egyptian writers that Osiris, the central figure of a great Egyptian cycle of sacred myths, was driven from India in the form of Apis, the sacred bull, and that therefore this wisdom cult which he represented was of Asiatic origin. We find the same thinking largely among the Orphics, among the Greek mystics. For Orpheus, whose name means the Dark One, was apparently also an Asiatic, and the roots of Greek legendary will probably be traced ultimately to the tremendous storehouse of early Vedic and Aryan Hindu legendary. In fact, practically every legend and myth to be found in Greece can be discovered also in the earlier writings of the ancient Hindu Arya peoples. This being more or less an established, recognized fact, we then conceive the purpose of these fables. Why were they prepared? What was the reason that man, possessing certain instinctive or basic knowledge, chose to conceal this knowledge? Why should he create a fable when he might have told a fact? Why did he find it more expedient to conceal, or at least to partly obscure, than to have revealed the simple substance of the story? Perhaps the answer lies in several things. One is the importance of the obscure method for the perpetuation of knowledge. Knowledge presented in its most obvious and outward nature is neither controversial nor essentially stimulating. If we say to a man, "This is so," we gain from him only two possible reactions: acceptance or rejection. If, however, we confront him with a riddle, we gain a third reaction, and that reaction is inquiry, or inquisitiveness, or a certain stimulation, and we bring into activity the instinct of man to solve a riddle, or to seek a meaning for the mysterious. Thus a fact is but a flat surface, but a riddle is a mirror, and each individual solving a riddle draws something from himself. And by the very ways in which these riddles are propounded, it is obvious that their intention is to intrigue the mind, to awaken its faculties, to call upon its resources, and in this way and in these ways to stimulate the growth of mind. I think perhaps the answer is rather obvious in many of the difficulties and dilemmas of modern education. Dealing as we do today with so-called facts, we produce students who accept and memorize these facts, take examinations, and pass with honors according to their memories. Yet these students are not intrigued either to explore into the mysteries behind facts, or to seek those sovereign realities from which facts are suspended, and of which facts are but themselves dim shadows. So in ancient times, men seem to prefer to be excited in their imaginations, and to be called upon to solve strange and uncertain things, thus gaining strength or releasing the solutional powers of consciousness itself. The second probable answer to this riddle is that the interval or the qualitative similitudes between scriptures and fables, these intervals are exceedingly slight, and there is scarcely a scripture that is not burdened with fable, and there is scarcely a fable that does not contain within it some element of scripture. Scriptures relate to a revelation of the divine ways and purposes. Fables, to a measure, have the same import. For beneath the surface of both scripture and fable is a veiled account of processes, procedures, purposes in the universe, things which perhaps in themselves may not easily be explained, and may remain even now comparatively unsolvable, and yet about which men must think, and about which they must come to certain rational, if not inevitable, conclusions. Thus, if Scripture is revelation, fable is rationalization. It is man calling upon the individual and collective resources of his own nature in the effort to bring cosmos out of chaos and to order his world and to integrate his own relationships with living things. The Egyptians tell us that fables are word symbols, that they are stories in symbolism, and that all fables are derived from the greatest fable of all, and that is nature. For as scriptures come from God, fables come from nature, and history comes from man. And these differences are well worth our thinking. Everything we see in nature may have a literal meaning, but it is also fabulous, because there is no process, no procedure or condition in nature which totally reveals itself. It gives us some part of a large story and conceals the rest. Those who are content to accept the surfaces of nature as the total of it limit themselves and to a measure drift toward that materialism which is a self-blindness imposed by the will upon the eyes of the mind. Everywhere in nature we see operations, procedures, methods. We behold what we term phenomena. And phenomena itself is a series of visible, knowable, or tangible circumstances, suspended from unknown, invisible, and intangible noumenal causes. Every natural phenomena, therefore, tells us something of this noumenal or invisible power which is behind the phenomenal. Thus, through the study of nature, we become aware of the substance of God. And through meditation upon both God and nature, we become aware of the compound constitution of man. Thus, the procedure of faith is a procedure receiving the authority of nature, for it is nature's way of explanation. Nature never speaks, even through its oracles, except in veiled and mystical hexameter. Nature never says, "This thou shalt do," or "This thou shalt not do." Nature presents rather spectacles, by which the outworkings of all things are gradually but inevitably revealed. And those most adroit in the interpretation of nature are the first to perceive the truthful answers to the riddles. These truthful answers, then, are merited and earned, as all knowledge must be, by the native inquiry of the human mind. And those who would have answers must be prepared to seek them, to meditate for them, to penetrate the outer shapes and appearances of things by faculties gradually developed and by powers of inspiration or intuition wonderfully related to the psychology of ancient philosophy. One more extension of this thinking, namely, that in ancient times religion was taught almost completely through sacred drama. And sacred drama consisted of cunningly devised rites, rituals, by which certain basic laws or rules of human behavior, or of the chemistries and alchemies of associations of living things, were summarized, digested, integrated into abridged forms and patterns, and presented to the beholder as mystical rites, revealing, expounding, unfolding the ways of the gods and the duties and responsibilities of mortals. Therefore, fables, like plays or dramas, have their morals. And we may go either to be entertained or to be informed. Modern man reads fables to be entertained. Ancient man read them instinctively to be informed, for he considered them to be but the outer appearances of things most necessary to his mind. Thus, it is very probable that what we call today mythology had for the most part its origin in the sacred rituals, rites, and ceremonies of that archaic period which is referred to as the unknown part of the duration of the world. And we can, to a measure, restore this from the contacts we still have with aboriginal peoples and with those primitive cultures which have still survived and which present their findings almost completely in the form of fables and of legends. We may also realize that in these ancient religions there was a dimension which we would term today magic, or perhaps call fantasy. Nearly all ancient religions, rituals, and mysteries, and even those today of primitive man, depend upon the invocation of faculties and powers within man associated with an extrasensory gamut. The idea of extrasensory perception, or the apperception of things not immediately visible. Thus we have in the beginning trances, visions, fastings. We have human beings seeking the mystery of their own origin by going away into the desert to pray, to meditate, to cry out to the very elements themselves, asking the spirits abiding in the air or in the fire or in the earth should communicate to them such knowledge as was necessary for the survival of mankind. The answers to these supplications came in vigil, in sleep, in dreams, in visions, and in the strange phenomena perhaps of disordered minds. But through all of this, man's contact with the unconscious source of things was through the disordered fabrics of his own dreaming. And in dreams he could have monsters. In dreams no reasonable or rational relationships were essential. In dreams times and distances were annihilated. And in his dreams men met worlds of forces and circumstances totally beyond their comprehension. Yet we know today that such dreams were in some way the subjective pressures of these growing creatures themselves, and that through these dreams man contacted the archetypal life behind him, and therefore from his dreams and his vigils came his codes, his laws, his morals, and his ethics. And these in turn made possible the rise of his cultures. All this then seems to justify or validate the secret or the profound meaning of ritual, myth, allegory, legend, and fable. It would be natural, of course, that men dreaming should dream according to their own natures. And if it was true that the Romans dreamed of empire, it is also true that the Greeks dreamt of wisdom. And for that reason, their dreams could be filled with symbols peculiarly suitable to their rational powers of interpretation. For the symbol arises in the dreamer himself, and is of substance and likeness with his own character. A philosophic people would therefore have philosophic dreams, and these dreams in turn, interpreted by others of similar minds, would gradually give solidity and foundation to great concepts. and to noble convictions about the ways of life and nature. Thus, in approaching Greek mythology, we are coming upon an alphabet of symbols. And I think we are perfectly justified in assuming that men, scholars, mystics, sages, of such caliber as Aristotle, Plato, Pythagoras, Euclid, Socrates, that these men did not believe that Zeus took upon himself the form of a bull and abducted Europa. Nor do I think these persons would have accepted or worshipped a concept of religion which said that Zeus lived because he carried the horned god Zagreus within his golden thigh. These things were not intended to be literal. And it is very doubtful if the majority of cultivated, cultured Grecians from the first millennium or 1,000 years BC to the beginning of the Christian era ever held such stories in literal regard. We know from the comedies of Aristophanes and of other writings of the period that many of these fables were contained within the religious rituals of the mysteries, and that most of them that came finally to become the children's fairy tales of today did originate within these sacred rites and institutions. And we are therefore impelled from the very common sense of it to assume, as is indicated by the writings of Plato, and certainly more than sustained by the great Neoplatonic restoration in Alexandria, that the Greeks were perfectly aware that these legends were the outer vestments or shadows of philosophic truths, in which certain things not easily presented in words could be arcanely intimated and could incite the reasoning power of the individual and encourage him to the profound contemplation of the universal mysteries. And in such a spirit, then, as this, we can begin to study some of these fables in their cosmological implications. We cannot cover most of them because the Grecian collection is of incredible diversity. And we must also remember, as Lord Bacon pointed out, that there are many versions or forms of single legends, and these, in all probability, represent local coloring from the various provinces, towns, and communities of the Greek states, each of which developed its own interpretations to these legends and associated them particularly with the deities of their own communities. What then, shall we say, in substance, did the Greeks understand by their principal deities, by that great group, the 12 major divinities of the Olympic pantheon? How are they to be understood in the Greek mythology? I think we are perfectly safe in assuming from Plato, from Pythagoras, and from other sources that by these deities the Greeks meant not personal divinities, but symbolic terms, embodiments or personifications of those universal principles which lie at the root of life. And that as we refer to certain qualities and principles as energy, power, vitality, will, that the Greeks used deities to embody these principles. And why, perhaps, were they wiser than we are? Perhaps because the whole concept of mythology makes principles, energies, powers, elements, substances, worlds, and creations living and intelligent beings rather than merely conditions or states. The Greeks, therefore, did not consider the earth to be merely a chemical mystery. They regarded it as a being, a living thing. And I think we must remember that our Western way of life, particularly that which developed in Europe in the last 15 to 1800 years, our European descent of tradition, is the only important descent of tradition recorded in which the great creating or created conditions of existence were regarded as irrational, unreasonable, or merely as physical and chemical constructions. The ancients did not regard any quality that exists as being without life, without consciousness, without a subsistence in the divine plan and pattern of things. I was reading not long ago a recent work dealing with the rise of Christian religion by a very fine and wonderful man whom we have all greatly honored, Dr. Schweitzer. This man pointed out in connection with the speech of Paul at Athens, in which St. Paul refers to the altar of the unknown God. And Dr. Albert Schweitzer says that in his estimation, there could not have been an altar to an unknown God in the Acropolis at Athens, for the reason that the Greeks were unaware of the existence of a superior being in the sense of one God. I do not think, in spite of my great admiration for the good doctor, that this position is tenable. There is every evidence in the Orphic rituals, in the writings of Plato and of Socrates, and even in the metaphysics of Aristotle, that the Greeks were perfectly aware of the existence of a primordial, eternal, and unconditioned being, a root, an eternal and everlasting life at the source of things. But in the Greek way of life, this deity did not reside alone in the vast expanse of heaven, connected to his creation only by an order of angels or archangels, or such hierarchs as Paul describes in the cherubs and the seraphs and the various thrones and dominions occupying space. To the Greeks, the supreme power unfolded through a series of secondary divinities. These divinities, all subservient to first cause, suspended from it as beautiful blossoms from a single tree, and therefore that the principal deities of the Greeks were all of them the specialized attributes of one being. That if one of these deities represented justice, and another represented law, and a great train of the Muses followed after the Pythian Apollo, so all of these divinities, both superior and inferior, both the great orders and the lesser orders, were all to be regarded as the infinitely diversified manifestations of one universal being. And that this one universal being, rooted in eternity, was the eternal cause, before which there could be no other cause, and that the primary manifestations of this cause was to cause in itself other manifestations to come into being, so that the great orders of gods were the extensions of one power in various worlds, planes, levels, and degrees. And by means of this concept, a great network of analogies was brought into existence, so that the gods could exist upon all levels, and finally, that the entire divine order might descend together and inhabit man. And just as surely as man is an extension of God in nature and in time, so man by his existence does not deny God, nor does the individuality of man deny the universality of God, nor do the diversifications of man deny the unity of God. Just as surely, therefore, as man exists as a focal point in the manifestation of a divine order, so other focal points may exist. To recognize these is not idolatry. It is rather to recognize, as we must all do, that the unveiled and naked face of God no man hath ever seen, and that wherever we turn looking for deity, we behold the manifestations of this cause, but not the cause itself. We may see the valleys that have been watered by these fountains, but the Father of the fountains we do not see. We therefore recognize deity only by the numerous faces or expressions which we observe in the great unfolding of nature. We may seek for God in fire. We may hear Him in the winds. We may seek to discover Him in the spirit within ourselves, or in the eyes of a newborn babe. And perhaps we see God in all these things, but the naked face of God we do not see. The Greeks believed this from a philosophical standpoint. They believed, therefore, that we might know deity as Zeus. We might recognize him in the great statue of this deity that stood in the temple of Olympus. We might recognize deity as Vesta, guarding the fires. We might recognize this deity in the strength of Achilles, or in the wisdom of Nestor. We might see this deity in the lawfulness of Zeus, or perhaps in the unlawfulness of Hades. But this God, this eternal principle, is known only through its works. And the first works of the eternal were the gods. And these first works were merely the extensions of this eternal being into condition, by means of which worlds could come into being, by which all the elements could be differentiated, by which all natures could be formed and found. Thus, at the root of our Grecian lore, there must lie, as Hesiod has pointed out, the root and substance. And this root and substance tells us that in the beginning there was a total existence, which is called unaging time. This unaging time lived forever in its own foreverness, and the Greeks did not even attempt to name it. This was the unknown God. But do not misunderstand, this is not the unknown God upon the altar which St. Paul describes. Because in the structure, the Greek structure of the inscription on that altar, an unknown supreme being could not be signified. All that the Greeks had built was an altar to a deity about which they were uncertain. Because this altar was the result of a plague which afflicting Athens, the Greeks offered a sacrifice upon the altar of each deity that they worshipped, but the plague did not end. They therefore built another altar to signify any and all deities they may not have known to worship, and placed the offering upon that, and the plague abated. So this was the story of the god, of the altar described by Paul in his sermon to the Athenians. But the fact is that the Greeks did possess this concept of the great threefold, thrice deep darkness, the mysterious abyss of the Chaldean oracles, that which was forever and forever the same. This deity they could not worship, because they could not conceive that they could approach it or depart from it, that they could add to it or detract from it. They could not conceive that this being would be aware of them, or in turn could be without awareness of them. They had no concept of how this eternal, unconditioned foreverness, this total, this unconsciousness as the fullness of all consciousness, this minus which was the total plus, this they could not rationally conceive. And these philosophers of Greece explained it very simply, and their explanation has never been improved upon. Namely, that man is an imperfect fragment of eternity. Therefore, he may analyze fragments and interpret them, but he has not the power within himself to define a completeness which he cannot experience. So this unknown God became the root, the source of all things. And it remained in its own everlastingness. And it remained thus for the 7 eternities of its own darkness. And at the end of the 7 eternities, there was caused within this darkness a motion. A motion which we have come to call the fiat, or the word, and which the Greeks represented by a mysterious halo of the 7 vowels, and which the Hebrews later called the Elohim, or the formators of the dawn. And a great motion, the motion of Tao in China, was conceived as existing within the completeness of being. And there arose within the infinite, which is the all number of Pythagoras, the utter principle of numeration, there arose the beginning of a dual existence. And this dual existence the Greeks called ether and chaos. Though ether and chaos represented merely a subjective and eternal polarity, and ether and chaos also possessed another strange attribute, because ether in the Greek mythology is used interchangeably in this creative pattern with Eros, or the deity of love. So that the Greeks referred to ether or energy as love. And they declared that at the beginning, the striving of love and chaos, or the striving of energy and the rudiments of matter, chaos being that which was subjectively or negatively unconditioned, resulted in the formation of a strange and whirling mass which they termed the egg, and is the same as the Hindu mystery of the world egg, Hiranyagarbha. This mysterious egg was supposed also to be the egg of love, and it was guarded and protected by Eros. But within it there grew and came into existence a strange and wonderful being, the first to be born from the mysterious egg. And this egg is almost equivalent to the story which we find in the Finnish epic, the Kalevala, where we have the goose laying the egg of iron, which is to be the world. In this legendary, therefore, ultimately, the egg formed of the strivings of ether and chaos burst asunder and revealed resplendent Thales, the ancient Greek symbol of rational light. This was the light not of the world of men, but the light of the universe. And Thales emerged much in the appearance of the cherub of Ezekiel, because this Greek Thales had the head of a man, a bull, a lion, and an eagle, and was winged, and its body was surrounded with serpents. And Thales burst from the egg, and the gold and silver hemispheres of the egg became heaven and earth. And in the great luminous distance between these dwelt this god, who was called also Proteus, or the god of many forms and faces. And Thales, as the rational principle, was said to possess no likeness except the face that others bestowed upon him. In any instant he could change his total being, and to all who saw him he appeared different, but in substance he was always the same. Thinking about him has been somewhat restored by a recent book, The God with 1,000 Faces, for Thales had all faces and all natures, because under the term of rational light we conceive of everything that exists, and under the form of rational light also we conceive of the creations. And Thales is the great archetypal reason that bursts from the egg of duality, or is born out of the great focal point, which is the egg, which is set up at the boundary point between universal unconsciousness and universal subconsciousness. Therefore, out of the unknown came the first great dream, which is the striving of the unconscious and the subconscious, ether and chaos. And it is Thales who impregnated the subconscious with the dynamic archetype of being, and there appeared therefore the dim background of the divine plan and the divine order. Thales was in a mysterious manner also the firstborn of the Logos. For Thales, or reason, was the first blazing similitude of the infinite threefold darkness that lay behind. No further could man conceive than this, that he might sense or capture one of the infinite likenesses of this rational light, because behind that light was only darkness, and behind that light was the ever-abiding power that could not be defined, which could not be known, but could be recognized only through its thousands of faces, facing all ways, the symbol of the great rational power of the world. Now, out of this division, then, of Thales and the power of the great age which was broken asunder to release him, came the symbol of subjective consciousness. Thales, the many-winged, the many-headed, the many-armed. And the upper part of this egg, or the golden egg of space, was itself also a living being. And upon that living being was bestowed the name heaven. And when the Greeks wished to refer to heaven, they didn't say heaven as we do, because they did not conceive of it merely as a bowl. They did not conceive of it as the empyrean of the medieval astronomers, or that which lies beyond the realm of the fixed stars. They did not conceive of it as John in the Apocalypse, in which he found a little door in the sky and went through into the mysterious world above the firmament. Because to the ancients, heaven was not merely a place. Heaven was a being. Because after all, what we call places must all be beings in the Greek mythology. And whatever we call a sphere of activity or a law or a place or an abode must be a sovereign intellect, a sovereign creature, either an intelligible, that is, a self-knowing being, or an intellectual, or not self-knowing being. Thus the Greeks divided, as Plato tells us, all of their deities into orders, of which the two most important were the intelligible and the intellectual gods. The intelligible gods were the highest, because by intelligible they meant deities partaking of the power of self-knowing. The second or lower order were the intellectual gods, those which possess the power to know other things but not themselves. And we find this same thing arising in the story of Odin in the Nordic legends. Odin, like Jupiter or Zeus, was the father of the intellectual gods, or the lower order, because Odin could know all things, but he could not know his own fate. Therefore, he called forth Erda, the Earth Mother, begging her to reveal the mystery of his destiny. She would not tell him. He went to the foot of the great tree Yggdrasil, and there he cast an eye into the pool of Mimir, because he was told that if his eye be single, then he might know the mystery of his own fate. But still he did not know. He then hung himself upon the world tree, a crucified Savior, seeking thus to know the mystery, but he could not. Nor could the Greek gods of Olympus know that which was their own ultimate condition and nature. Only the intelligible gods could know these things, and they were much higher. But heaven, which was the chief of the intelligible gods, therefore gods knowing within themselves, and also chief of those gods which are called the unmoved movers of all things. Heaven had to be a being, because within heaven all things lived and moved and had their being. Is forever passing. So Uranus is eternal time, within which things neither grow old, nor have beginning, nor have end. And Uranus is the pre-symbol of the Golden Age, and all the divine worlds, and all the divine powers that inhabit them. Now, eternity, or unaging time, gives birth to time, as we know it by a mystery. And the firstborn of heaven was Cronus, or Saturn. And Saturn is time. And it is time that turns and unthrones its own father, taking upon itself the control of the universe, and forces its own will upon creation. So Saturn, or time, or Cronus, rebels against eternity and usurps the kingdom. And from that time, all things are the slaves of time. Now, to the Greeks, time was not just a dimension, something that you measure on a clock. Time was a living thing. And it is not impossible that we shall ultimately come to this same realization, that time is a creature with a body, a form, and a kind, and that time will never be solved, or its mystery will never be understood, until we realize that time is a conscious entity and not merely a flowing of years as we think of it. Perhaps some of the researches of Einstein have suggested that time is more than first meets the eye, a great and universal mystery not easily solved. Now, time, having taken over the universe, is very jealous, and therefore time, having emasculated its own father and destroyed it, or obscured it by its own laws, because in this case destruction means the submergence of a previous state. And this is actually the destruction of objectivity. For the moment man becomes objectively aware, he destroys a subjective pre-state, or forces what he was once conscious of back into his unconscious, whereas he polarizes a new level of consciousness. So eternity is destroyed by being submerged behind the illusion of time. This the Greeks were well aware of. And Saturn has a considerable progeny. But because Saturn is time, and because time has within itself the power to absorb everything which is created within it, Saturn devours all of his own children. Because time absorbs or dissolves or destroys or returns to itself everything which is engendered from it. For nothing that is born in time can have an eternal duration. So that which is part of time dies in time. Worlds, having fallen under the yoke of time, must be dissolved. All compounds existing within time must again be resolved into their basic elements. But by a subterfuge, Zeus was preserved, and Saturn received instead of his son a stone to devour. And Zeus, therefore, escaped from the power of time. And by Zeus, the Greeks understood, therefore, the next logoic power. And this was the power of law. The lawful universe, which in its turn overcame time. Now again, it simply means not that time was destroyed, but Zeus turned and took again the kingdom from his father. And he did so by placing his own power objectively before his father. And out of the mystery of this circumstance comes the symbolism of the great power of universal law. Now, law and order, or the great integration the establishment of a vast sense of legality in space, the setting up of the great laws, obscures the mystery of time. And today, in the person or power of Zeus, we have the beginning or the dawn of the human objective consciousness. For in Zeus we have self, the concept of self, which stands firmly against the mystery of time. The human being has never acknowledged as a psychic fact within himself the experience of time. And he opposes the limitation of time by the eternity within himself. And he seeks also to defeat time by the organization of the universe. And we have a common word we use today in connection with mechanistic organization: time saving. To make time stretch, to get more into time, to defeat time, to break the power of time to break us. And the way we defeat time is by the establishment of the power of Zeus, or the logos of self-consciousness. And self-consciousness stands against time. Now, in turn, Zeus, having been established as the supreme power of those deities which may not know its own essential nature, the chief of the intellectual powers of nature, corresponding with the third logos of the Christian Greek theology, corresponding again in the Scriptures with the prince of this world, or the Gnostic Ildaboa, or the Greek Demiurgus, or the Egyptian deity Osiris. These are all gods of the world, gods of objective creation. For up to this time, creation has been a subjective power. The gods, therefore, like the Hindu divinities and the northern Buddhist divinities, are represented as 12. These 12 actually being the manifestations or emanations of Zeus, who becomes a kind of zodiac, within whose nature the mundane world takes place, or comes into existence. And this concept is preserved, of course, in the 12 patriarchs, the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples, and all of the mysteries of the 12, and the association of the sun and the zodiac. Now, the rise of the 12 objective powers of consciousness, which constitute the total nature of Zeus, forces into objectivity by the law of emanationism, as understood in the Gnostic and Kabbalistic teaching. The moment a positive power is manifested, a negative receptivity comes into existence. Every light creates a shadow. Every positive power brings forth out of the abyss its shadow, its negative reflection. So when the 12 gods seated themselves upon the Olympic throne as the 12 powers of the conscious self, either in the solar system or in man, the result immediately was the arising from space, from chaos, from the undo part, from the world below, from the formless materials from which the world was to be fashioned. There arose 12 giants, or 12 chaotic powers called the Titans. And for vast ages of time, the gods and the Titans were locked in conflict. And this conflict consisted of the struggle between cosmos as law and chaos as matter. And what we are actually confronted with
is this problem of law imposing itself upon matter, and the great conflict between activity and inertia, the great conflict of organizing the vast area of material resource into the likeness and similitude of the divine plan. Now this struggle went on for a great period of time, and the struggle apparently was purposeless, ageless, and meaningless until law, which was of course the direct descendant of heaven by divine right, although each had achieved its end by usurpation. In other words, each one had stolen the kingdom. And in this you concentrate upon the concept of the diminishing or lowering levels of consciousness, in which each lower degree achieves its end by stealing the kingdom from a higher degree. So that by the time we get down to what the metaphysician of the 19th century called mortal mind, we're down very close to Zeus. And somewhere in the background, divine mind has been deprived unjustly of its kingdom. So these degrees of consciousness all represent the stealing of something greater, or the locking of something greater, or the submerging of something greater, and a lesser power taking over. Until in the person or in the concept of Zeus, we have personal consciousness, the egoic self, self-will. We have the concept of a man as master of the universe, or of the deity who is to mold the world according to its own nature, taking the place gradually of the great God who has been obscured. This can only happen, of course, if this lesser deity belongs to an intellectual order of gods, because the prerequisite of rebellion is that this power does not know its own source. If it knew its own source, it could not rebel. Therefore, Zeus can know anything of what is going to come from him, what is to do. But where he came from, he cannot know. Therefore, he becomes a free agent, like man. And because he is a free agent, he creates a world in the abyss and locks that world in a terrible struggle, which we find also emphasized in the Götterdämmerung, or the ultimate conflict of light and darkness, the Armageddon, or the last great war of Egypt, or the battlefield of Kurukshetra in the Hindic classic, the Bhagavad Gita. Now, Zeus is law, beholds itself locked forever with the Titans. Law fighting, and darkness reacting. And the more violently law imposes itself, the more violently the Titans react, until these two powers become involved in the tremendous struggle which almost might be regarded as equivalent to the strivings of a nebular hypothesis in space, the world coming into existence. Then it is that Zeus unites with Semele, a mysterious symbol of sleep or of dreams. Perhaps we have almost a yogic. Zeus, by interior visualization or fantasy, creates within himself or impregnates illusion or imagination, Semele, with his own son, who is the likeness of himself. Semele is destroyed by the blaze of the celestial power of Zeus himself. The child is rescued and placed in an artificial womb in the thigh of Zeus, and there it is maintained until birth, and there is born from the thigh of Zeus, from the union of law and fantasy or imagination is born the horned Zagreus, Dionysus, later Bacchus. Therefore, Bacchus becomes the only begotten of law, and in turn the god of ecstasy. Dionysus, which is the true deity, the lord of the vine, the dance, and the theater. Dionysus is the deity that has no evil and no negative or destructive power within it whatever. Now there are many, many fables concerning this deity. But in the oldest forms, this deity is nearly always represented as a small child with some of the attributes of Cupid, who is also very important, far more than merely a sentimental divinity as we are inclined to think. But Bacchus is the one, or Dionysus, is the one for whom Zeus intends the kingdom. For Zeus feels that in this Dionysus, or the god of the sacred dance, is the ultimate rulership of the empire to be vested. Therefore, Zeus ordered Bacchus to be brought up in a mountain, and appointed to him in the beginning a panther for a nurse. Now it's interesting, of course, that in the old Jewish rites and stories, it is said that the original name of Jesus was Jehoshua ben Pantera, which means Jehoshua, or Jesus, the son of the panther. This legend carries through in an important manner. The first miracle of Dionysus, or Bacchus, was the transforming of water into wine at a wedding feast. IHS, now seen on the altar cloths of churches, is the original monogram of Dionysus. He was the vine, and ye are the husbandmen. He was the Lord of the vine, and he was also the first deity of the Greco-Western world to be ritually worshipped by the Eucharist. Now, the condition of Dionysus in this particular problem is most intriguing. He is the heir to the kingdom. Yet he is not a deity of law primarily, but a deity of visions. A deity who went around the world associated with dance and flowers and surrounded by spirits who sang and danced with him. And he was given old Silenus for a teacher, a strange and ancient man who was most mysteriously wise. And old Silenus more or less represented in those days what our term silence means today. For inspiration was given silence as its master, a very proper and appropriate state of affairs, indicating that we are definitely dealing with meaningful circumstances. Now, while this deity, Dionysus, was still a very small lad, Zeus gave him the universe as a plaything. And he gave to him a mysterious whirling toy, like a top that spins, and which some mythologists have considered to be a symbol of the chakra of Vishnu, the wheel, the symbol of cosmic motion. And this music instruments, some of which later returned in the symbolism of the deity Pan. But one thing that this deity, this wonderful, radiant, glorious child, was forever warned, was that he must not wander far from Olympus. Because if he wandered too far away, he might come to the end of law and order. as ruled over by Zeus, seated upon his ancient throne and watching the world with his single eye. And if the little godling should wander too far away, he might fall into the clutches of the Titans or the chaotic forces of nature and be destroyed. But the Titans, or the negative powers, were determined to destroy Dionysus, because they conceived in him the power of ecstasy, by means of which that could be accomplished which law could not achieve. They knew also that this god of beauty was to sometime take the place of law, and that beauty was sometime rule the world. And that beauty, which was the first begotten of law, contained all law within itself, but something else, vision. This mysterious power of ecstasy. So they made a mirror, did these wicked, nasty Titans, and they caused this deity to see itself reflected in the mirror, and Narcissus-like, it followed its own reflection, thinking it had found a playfellow in space. And when they had lured the god far away from the throne of Zeus, the Titans turned upon the infant Dionysus and slew him. And of course his spirit or soul returned to Zeus, to be born again later. But his body was torn apart and was cooked upon a fire by the Titans, and they devoured the infant's body. Now Zeus, upon his mighty throne, was not able to foresee or to see the Titans, but he smelt the burning flesh. And he then caused his attention to become set upon this mystery and saw what had occurred. And he sent Pallas Athena, born from his own mind, like Brunhilde, born from the will of Odin. And he caused her to take the head and soul of Dionysus and return it to him. This is like the head of Orpheus, that continued to give oracles after the body had been torn apart by the Ciconian women. And after the head and soul had been rescued, Zeus turned his thunderbolts upon the Titans and completely incinerated them in his wrath. And he changed them into ashes. And then from these ashes, which contained the blood of Dionysus, the gods fashioned the bodies of the first human beings. And then therefore all human beings are composed of the ashes of the Titans and the blood of Dionysus. Now it would be quite incredible to assume that such stories have merely fabulous intent, that they deal with very deep and obscure and arcane mysteries of life we cannot easily doubt. For we realize that from that time on, Zeus could not destroy man, because if he turned again his wrath against the Titans, he turned also his hate against the blood of his own son. So from that point on, Zeus could not destroy man without turning his wrath against his own blood. And of course the blood of Dionysus represented the sole power in man, or the divine presence of the Logos. And Dionysus was again reborn, and his mysteries and rites were established. And he formed the great mysteries by which man was to be educated and restored. But over the power of law, therefore, came the power of love and beauty in the power of Dionysus. And therefore Socrates declares the great powers of the universe to be the one, the beautiful, and the good. And the beautiful is in each case the power of the redemption by ecstasy, or by the internal vision of reality. Now the mystery of this again occurs in an entirely different similitude in another fable, And that is when Aeneas descends into the underworld, and also when Cori descends into the abode of Hades, or Dis, to rescue her daughter Persephone, who had been abducted. In order to descend into the underworld and return alive, it is necessary that the traveler should find the golden bough that grows upon the tree. There is only one golden bough in the world at a time. And it is a strange thing that, like a mistletoe or an orchid, has no root of its own, but grows upon some other tree hidden in the forest. Who carries this bough will be able to pass the three-headed dog upon the threshold, and may safely go into the lower world and return again. Now, what is this mysterious golden bough? We have no question from the context of the story that this bough represents the intuitional soul of man, which grows not upon its own tree, but upon another tree, and who possesses it can descend into the underworld or the world of matter and return alive, because of the power of the psychic nature within. This is again a symbol very close to the essential meaning of Dionysus, who becomes in its various embodiments and powers the symbol of universal beauty and the psychic life of man himself. Thus, in these legends and mysteries, we have some very interesting and valuable accounts, telling us of great and important matters, telling us much of philosophy and of the deeper mysteries of religion and of the great sacred ritual dramas of antiquity. Now, we also must face and recognize always the arising of the great hero cycle. And we must also realize that the Greeks represented a kind of human being who after death could be taken to heaven and become a constellation. And many of the constellations of the zodiac and the non-zodiacal bands were originally supposed to have been heroes, like Cassiopeia, or the winged horse, Pegasus, and all these different symbols for when some very great and glorious achievement occurred, then the soul might be taken up and become a star or a constellation. And in the story of the soul, we have perhaps an excellent example of the great classic drama of Greece, Oedipus Rex, which gives us another important commentary on this matter. Oedipus is one of the deities that, like Moses and Sargon and many others, including Romulus, was discarded by its parents, or his parents, and set out to die, was discovered by a shepherd and taken to the court of a neighboring king. Now, all this happened because of an oracle. For before the birth of this child, Oedipus, the oracle said that he would kill his own father, marry his own mother, and destroy the empire. So when the child was born, its parents were naturally loath to rear it and left it to die. But before this, they pierced its feet so that it would always have great trouble in walking. Raised in the family of a neighboring king, like Moses, and unaware that these were its foster parents and not its own, young Oedipus became aware of the story of the oracle, and fearing that his foster parents were his own, and would therefore feel the curse, he left them, that he might never cause them ill. And upon the road, coming upon a charioteer and a rich prince, there was an argument in which he slew both the charioteer and the man in the chariot, who proved to be his own father. He then later confronted the Sphinx, a mysterious monster with many parts compounded. And this monster ravaged the road of Thebes, and all who could not answer her riddle perished. And the Thebans offered the widow of their king in marriage to the man who could destroy the Sphinx. Oedipus was able to do so by answering the riddle, for the riddle and the answer were both man. Thus he returned to Thebes, married his mother as the oracle had foretold, and was later convicted of the murder of his father. He had placed a curse upon the murder of his father without knowing that he was the murderer. And in the catastrophes and tragedies that followed, his life was one terrible, embittered existence, until finally he was brought to peace by the graces, and in a little grove gave up his spirit and returned to the other world. It was a very tragic and terrible story. But let us remember that here we have two tremendous conflicts. First of all, we have the riddle of the Sphinx. And the Sphinx, as we know, was always among ancient peoples the symbol of the unknown. The Sphinx was consequently the symbol, in a way, of nature, whose various parts are always represented as a compound. Oedipus is now the world hero. But Oedipus is more than this. Oedipus becomes the symbol of wisdom, the power which can destroy or solve the riddle of the unknown. Now, many men had attempted to answer the mystery and had all died. But Oedipus succeeded for one reason only, namely that he was crippled in his feet. And being crippled in his feet, he could not hurry. Therefore, wisdom bestows judgment, which prevents haste. And because he was without haste, because knowledge was not a victim of imprudent action, Oedipus was said to be able to solve the mystery. Like Hippocrates, the god of silence and wisdom of the Egyptians, who was also crippled in his lower parts. Because judgment cannot move fast, nor can wisdom be quickly perfected. All knowledge is imperfect in its lower parts, because it is without a full knowledge of its own foundation. The Sphinx, representing chimera or illusion, is man's struggle to solve the mystery of all things, to learn in the end that the mystery of everything is the mystery of himself, that who solves himself solves all. Then, as Lord Bacon points out in the Mysteries of the Ancients, the wisdom of the ancients, knowledge having overcome ignorance or illusion, or science having defeated the unknown, the carcass of the unknown is placed upon the body of an ass. For once knowledge is possessed by the wise, it can then be passed on to the foolish, and they can carry it forever. But wisdom comes upon its own tragedy, because the very wisdom that solves riddles is the wisdom of a broken heart. and wisdom is the carrier of the world's great tragedy. For that which by wisdom has destroyed illusion finds no happiness or security itself. It ends as a wanderer, blind and miserable, until finally it is brought to peace by the gracious deities of some far distant grove. There is no peace in the world for wisdom itself, because wisdom partakes of the nature of Zeus, but not of the nature of Dionysus. And it is the power of Dionysus that must save or redeem all of these things. Now, in the Greek legendary also, we have the story of worlds and how they come into being. Zeus is called the aerial deity because he abides in the sky, so called. And he is the etheric envelope or auric field which encloses the solar system. Now, Zeus manifests in turn through two other aspects of himself, for he is a triad of deities. In his own nature he is called Zeus and abides in the etheric diffusion. In his humid or liquid nature he is called Poseidon or Neptune. And Neptune was called the aquatic Zeus, for it is the same deity in another element. And when enclosed in the mystery of generation or matter, or as the substance of the world power locked within the atom, or within the material substances of nature, as the power which grows up through the earth with the budding grain. In these natures, Zeus is called Dis, spelled D-I-S, or the subterranean Zeus, or Hades. And all of these are one deity in three states. Therefore, in the higher or mental condition, Zeus is in his proper nature. In his vital or effluvive quality, known as his seminal nature, he is Neptune. And in his imprisoned or bodily aspect, he is Hades. These three natures, therefore, constitute together the one body of this God. And in this bodily structure, he refers also to the nature of man, because man consists of an intellectual nature, a vital or animative nature, and a material nature. Therefore, the objective consciousness of man imprisoned within body during the physical period of life is Dis, or Jupiter Hades. In the Latins, among the Latins, this Dis, or Hades, was called Pluto, or the compound god of death and wealth. Pluto, in his original nature, being the root of the word plutocracy, or plutocrat, indicated a well-financed state. Now, the Greeks and Latins were not wrong in this, because, of course, it is only in the material world that plutocracy has any meaning. Thus, Hades is the god of accumulation. And we can almost have the same concept in the Buddhist philosophy, where it is what we have and what we want that keep us in a state of perdition. So Hades rules those who are in turn ruled by possession, or by material things, of which he is the peculiar proprietor. His world is a world of dreams and of darkness. His world is a place where all things have a seemingly endless subsistence in monotony. The Greeks at that time, and later the Latins, felt that this traditional state was not one of punishment primarily, but one of continuance on a meaningless basis. You just went on doing unimportant things forever until you were bored with yourself and everyone else. You could have almost anything you wanted until you were so tired of it you never wanted it again. Until finally the desire to achieve or to be dominated completely the sufficiency and complacency of things. Then when you cried out that you were surfeited with the possessional concept, you were reminded that you were in perdition. So Hades, or Dis, or Pluto, was appropriately and properly the god of the material world. Now, what does this god of the material world signify in the compound nature of man? Obviously, it is his objective personality. It is the part of himself which believes in the reality of matter, which believes in the supreme significance of the present state of things. So the individual in this state is said to have entered into the underworld, and here to remain, like Proserpine, half of each year, or half of each life cycle, or half of each day. Because in sleep, when man is nothing, perhaps he is free from the mystery of illusion. He apparently knows nothing. Perhaps then he knows all. And anyway, the Greeks have these dreams about such matters. Now, in order to descend into this world of darkness, it was necessary for man to be rowed across the river of Styx by a blind boatman in a strange, dark ship. And we are reminded of the words of Heraclitus, who said that only a dry soul is wise. Now, that doesn't sound as though this merely meant one that was in lack of liquid nourishment. But between the airy abode of Zeus, which was the Olympian Mount, and the pits of Tartarus, which were beneath it, there was also upon the side of the mountain the springs of Helicon, from which Pegasus, striking with his hoofs, brought forth the waters of eternal life. The abode of the Muses and the Graces, and the great band of those that followed the Pythian Apollo. And here we come also to the river, which was called the river of life, or the river of waters, that flowed mysteriously between the upper world and the lower. And this watery abode, this humid mystery, was under the control of Neptune. And Neptune was therefore lord of the seas, and of all things that had to do with waters, and to him were given the control of all the continents and lands that existed in the sea, and he was, of course, the great deity who presided over the mystery of Poseidonus, or the lost Atlantic Empire. But what were these waters primarily? According to Heraclitus, with his dry soul and several other problems, they represented the mystery of humidity. Humidity, in turn, being the secret of generation. Souls falling into generation, or falling into the world, first passed through the sphere of humidity, which was represented by the river. which divided the invisible world from the material one. And this river, like water, which is Maya, or illusion, Mari, or the sea, Isis, Isa, the waters, all of these represent the symbol of illusion. And those who would enter into materiality must first drink of the water of Lethe and must forget reality. So once the soul enters into the mystery of generation, it loses the memory of its divine origin and falls into the mystery of birth. And having thus entered into the mystery of birth, it is unable to escape therefrom. On the other hand, the soul escaping through redemption, or the heroic state, must rise through the symbol of water and be carried to the other shore in the ship of the doctrine, as the northern Buddhist says. And we also have in the good old Christian hymn, one more river to cross. And that is the river of illusion. And we will be united with all our friends on the other shore, which is again the river of illusion. And that is why we have in the ancient Christian symbol of the church, the original church built in the form of a ship, for the reason, as in the fisherman's ring of the papacy, for the reason that the ship of the doctrine must carry the soul across the sea of illusion. This is the great expedition of the Argonauts, seeking for the golden fleece. This is again part of the wanderings of Odysseus, or Ulysses, who, being a hero of the order of Poseidonus, or the sea, was forced to overcome the oceans, or overcome illusion, in order to return to his native land. All these legends go on and on and on, and every one of them can be broken down into some part of the mysterious and psychic life of man himself. We also can see the thinking of this in the statement of Plato, that in the beginning of the world, the Logos impressed itself upon space in the form of a cross. We have an early recognition of the symbol of the cross and the Logos. We have the gradual rise of the rituals and mysteries which have caused men like Voltaire to insist that Plato should have been the first canonized saint of the Christian Church, because the greater part of the deeper rituals of Christianity were derived from the great symbolism of the Orphic mysteries and the great rituals of the Greek philosophies. Contemplating in such a manner upon fables, we can see why minds like Socrates and Plato would have regarded them as indispensable, and also why each in his turn might have invented others, or given new color and meaning to those already invented, and thus advanced this great philosophical, symbolical language, which when properly used and understood, transforms every one of these stories into a valid statement of universal laws. And the delight of this is that these valid statements are not the same as you will find literally presented in books. They are not the kind of statements that you can get even today from an approved text, although we've had 2,300 years since Plato to clarify these points. These statements have a strange, mysterious, mystical vitality in them, which is totally lost in what we call the exact knowledge of today. And in one simple fable is concealed more of reality than if some great text, most scholarly produced, and most detailedly analyzed. And furthermore, these fables sink immediately and inevitably into the consciousness of man, rising in him again through some reminiscence, through some recollection of things partly known or suspected, until they coax out of man some phase or shadow of his own psychic awareness. Thus they form an excellent and appropriate method of instruction.
states or periods of his own existence. The first, or the unknown, relates to sleep, and to that night which came before the dawn of consciousness, thus to man's unconscious nature. Fable, or the fabulous era, to dreams, and to those first stirrings of internal symbolism by which man sought to explain or understand the structure of his own nature, and therefore perhaps the first or unknown period may be termed the unconscious, the fabulous period the subconscious, the historical period the objectively conscious. For man's own life, from birth, or man's racial development from the dawn of time, both followed this course and this procedure. The Greeks, being naturally addicted to philosophy, were inclined to philosophize upon their fables. And perhaps this is not different from the standpoint of modern psychology, which is inclined to philosophize upon the fabrics of dreams, and to see in the confused experiences of sleep the keys to the rational processes of the human consciousness. Thus the Greek sought to explain or interpret these ancient fables as having a root in some common original state of unconscious knowing, and that these fables therefore contain within them truths, realities, and abstract yet mysterious facts which might have bearing and meaning and give us some light or insight into other and more recent happenings. And in thinking about this, lest perhaps we be accused of inventing, I'd like to call first to your attention a few lines or a few paragraphs from Lord Bacon's introduction to his Wisdom of the Ancients, a little work which his lordship dedicated largely to the interpretation of the mythology and legendary of the Greek authors. In his introduction to this work, he writes in one place, "The earliest antiquity lies buried in silence and oblivion, excepting the remains we have of it in sacred writ. This silence was succeeded by poetical fables, and these at length by the writings we now enjoy, so that the concealed and secret learning of the ancients seems separated from the history and knowledge of the following ages by a veil, or a partition wall of fables, interposing between the things that are lost and those that remain." A little later he adds, "Upon deliberate owe their existence and their survival to some secret and purposeful meaning which they possess, which, like the famous animal fables of Aesop, but thinly conceal or clothe moral realities or philosophical facts which are timeless and forever practical, useful, and immediate in their implications." Now, as Bacon points out, and I think no other author has come forward to refute him, the actual origin of the Latin and Greek mythologies is unknown. The Latins derived greatly from the Greeks, but upon a lower level of interpretation. For whereas the Greeks were essentially philosophers, the Latins were essentially economists, men of more practical and material interests and inclinations. And in their keeping, the religious mysteries of other nations lost much of their deeper and more sacred values. But to go then to the Greeks, and to discover, if possible, the origin of their legends, I think in most probability, the mythology of the Greek nations must be traced to Asia, probably through Egypt. And we are informed by the Egyptian writers that Osiris, the central figure of a great Egyptian cycle of sacred myths, was driven from India in the form of Apis, the sacred bull, and that therefore this wisdom cult which he represented was of Asiatic origin. We find the same thinking largely among the Orphics, among the Greek mystics. For Orpheus, whose name means the Dark One, was apparently also an Asiatic, and the roots of Greek legendary will probably be traced ultimately to the tremendous storehouse of early Vedic and Aryan Hindu legendary. In fact, practically every legend and myth to be found in Greece can be discovered also in the earlier writings of the ancient Hindu Arya peoples. This being more or less an established, recognized fact, we then conceive the purpose of these fables. Why were they prepared? What was the reason that man, possessing certain instinctive or basic knowledge, chose to conceal this knowledge? Why should he create a fable when he might have told a fact? Why did he find it more expedient to conceal, or at least to partly obscure, than to have revealed the simple substance of the story? Perhaps the answer lies in several things. One is the importance of the obscure method for the perpetuation of knowledge. Knowledge presented in its most obvious and outward nature is neither controversial nor This evening we are to discuss some phases at least of the Greco-Latin philosophical mythology. And I think we perhaps should begin by remembering the words of Varro, who declared that the duration of the world is divided into three parts, which should properly be termed the unknown, the fabulous, and the historical. Now, this is a rather different division from what we are most accustomed to, but Varro goes on to tell us that our concepts and conceptions of those parts of the world's duration which are unknown are set forth in scriptures which relate to such things as precede man or are before his reason and understanding. The second part, which is the fabulous, unfolds through the writings of poets, of mystics, and of those constructors and delineators of myths, of which Homer and Hesiod are typical examples. The third or historical part emerges slowly from the fabulous, and gradually we secure certain footings in known records and accounts, so that gradually, in the historic era, we become familiar with the positive and proven actions of men and vicissitudes of life and nature. In these divisions, therefore, that which is termed the fabulous is placed between the unknown and the historical. And we may be inclined to quote another statement of this, to the effect that mythology is the history of the prehistoric. Now, for man, what is prehistory? It is scarcely to be conceived as merely the record of the world in which he lived prior to his own geniture. More correctly, prehistory for man is the story of himself prior to the period of fable or of legend, or of any record or account which he may retain within his own consciousness, and relating to such matters as he may know only intuitively or inspirationally, or by some communion deeper than reason or understanding. Therefore, we may say that in these three are essentially stimulating. If we say to a man, "This is so," we gain from him only two possible reactions: acceptance or rejection. If, however, we confront him with a riddle, we gain a third reaction, and that reaction is inquiry, or inquisitiveness, or a certain stimulation, and we bring into activity the instinct of man to solve a riddle, or to seek a meaning for the mysterious. Thus, a fact is but a flat surface, but a riddle is a mirror. And each individual solving a riddle draws something from himself. And by the very ways in which these riddles are propounded, it is obvious that their intention is to intrigue the mind, to awaken its faculties, to call upon its resources, and in this way and in these ways to stimulate the growth of mind. I think perhaps the answer is rather obvious in many of the difficulties and dilemmas of modern education. Dealing as we do today with so-called facts, we produce students who accept and memorize these facts, take examinations, and pass with honors according to their memories. Yet these students are not intrigued either to explore into the mysteries behind facts, or to seek those sovereign realities from which facts are suspended, and of which facts are but themselves dim shadows. So in ancient times, men seem to prefer to be excited in their imaginations and to be called upon to solve strange and uncertain things, thus gaining strength or releasing the solutional powers of consciousness itself. The second probable answer to this riddle is that the interval or the qualitative similitudes between scriptures and fables, these intervals are exceedingly slight, and there is scarcely a scripture that is not burdened with fable, and there is scarcely a fable that does not contain within it some element of Scripture. Scriptures relate to a revelation of the divine ways and purposes. Fables, to a measure, have the same import. For beneath the surface of both Scripture and fable is a veiled account of processes, procedures, purposes in the universe. Things which perhaps in themselves may not easily be explained, and may remain even now comparatively unsolvable, and yet about which men must think, and about which they must come to certain consideration. My judgment is that a concealed instruction and allegory was originally intended in many of the ancient fables. This opinion may in some respects be owing to the veneration I have for antiquity, but more to observing that some fables discover a great and evident similitude, relation, and connection with the thing they signify, as well a little later he adds, it may pass for a further indication of a concealed and secret meaning that some of these fables are so absurd and idle in their narration as to show and proclaim an allegory, even afar off. A fable that carries probability with it may be supposed invented for pleasure or in imitation of history. But those that could never be conceived or related in this way must surely have a different use. For example, what a monstrous fiction is this, that Jupiter should take Metis to wife, and as soon as he found her pregnant, eat her up, whereby he also conceived, and out of his head brought forth Pallas Athena armed. Certainly no mortal could, but for the sake of the moral it couches, invent such an absurd dream as this, so much out of the road of thought. But the argument of most weight with me is this, that many of these fables by no means appear to have been invented by those persons who relate and divulge them, whether Homer, Hesiod, or others. For if I were assured that they first flowed from these later times and authors that transmit them to us, I should never expect anything singularly great or noble from such an origin. But whoever attentively considers the thing will find that these fables were delivered down and related by these writers, not as matters then first invented or proposed, but as things received and embraced in earlier ages. Besides, as they are differently related by writers nearly of the same age, it is easily perceived that the relators drew from the common stock of ancient tradition and varied but in points of embellishment, which is their own. And this principally raises my esteem of these fables, which I receive not as the product of the age or invention of the poets, but as sacred relics, gentle whispers, and the breath of better times, and from the traditions of more ancient nations came at length into the flutes and trumpets of the Greeks. Now I think that more or less summarizes the viewpoint that we wish to emphasize or explain or discuss this evening. Namely, that these fables, which have not only descended from old time, but have been perpetuated from generation to generation and from culture to culture,